The first knock didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like a question the desert had been waiting all night to ask. My name is Evan Mercer, and I was 38 years old when Jawbone Canyon taught me that silence can be louder than screaming. I'd been RV camping across California for years by then, logging miles through forests, coastlines, and deserts in a faded white Volkswagen camper I rebuilt myself. I trusted that van more than most people, trusted the road, trusted my experience, and more dangerously, I trusted my ability to explain things away. Jawbone Canyon was never supposed to be more than a stopover, a wide, open OHV area northeast of Mojave, dry, barren, scraped raw by wind and tires. No trees, no shade, just rock, dust, and a sky that felt too big once the sun dropped. I arrived late that afternoon, the desert glowing orange like it was burning from the inside out. October had cooled things down, but the heat still clung to the ground, radiating up through the soles of my boots when I stepped out. I remember noticing how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet, empty quiet. The kind that makes you aware of your own breathing. There were no other RVs nearby. A few dirt bike tracks cut through the sand, but they looked old, softened by wind. I parked on a flat stretch tucked between two low ridges, telling myself the rocks would block the wind. What they really blocked was visibility. By sundown, the temperature dropped fast. Desert cold doesn't creep, it snaps. I cooked inside the van, windows cracked just enough to vent the propane. That's when I first noticed the smell. Not sage, not dust, something sour, metallic almost, like rust and old water. It drifted in and out, faint enough to ignore, strong enough to register. I blamed it on the engine, maybe something heating up after the long drive. Rational explanations are comforting that way. They don't ask you to look too closely. By 10 o'clock, the canyon was pitch black. No moon, no lights. Just stars so sharp they felt like they were pressing down. I shut off the interior light and sat there for a moment, letting my eyes adjust. That's when the sounds started to separate themselves. Wind against rock. My own pulse in my ears, and somewhere far off, the low thrum of something moving, maybe a truck on a distant road, maybe imagination filling gaps. I told myself I was tired. Desert does that. Drains you. I crawled into the back of the van, pulled the blanket up to my chest, and closed my eyes. The first knock came at 11:47 p.m. It wasn't loud. That was the problem. It wasn't a bang or a crash or anything urgent. It was deliberate. Knuckles against metal. 3 taps. Slow. Evenly spaced. Right on the side panel of the van. I froze. In all my years camping, I'd learned the difference between animal sounds and human ones. Coyotes yip, foxes scream like they're being torn apart, wind rattles and scrapes. This wasn't any of that. This was intentional. I held my breath, listening, waiting for the follow-up. Voices, footsteps, laughter. Something that would tell me this was just someone lost or messing around. Nothing came. The silence afterward felt heavier than the knock itself. Like the canyon was leaning in, waiting to see what I'd do. I stayed still, heart hammering so hard I was sure whoever was out there could hear it through the van's thin walls. I told myself it was probably another camper, maybe someone needing help. That was the story I clung to, because the alternative required admitting I was alone in a place where being alone was a liability. After a full minute, I shifted just enough to peek through the front windshield. Nothing. No headlights, no silhouette, just darkness swallowing the edge of my vision. I waited longer. 5 minutes. 10. No second knock came. Eventually, adrenaline faded into exhaustion. I lay back down, telling myself I'd overreacted. That fear makes patterns where there are none. That experience doesn't mean immunity to nerves. Sleep came in shallow waves. I woke again to sound, not knocking this time, but movement. Footsteps. Slow. Careful, circling. They weren't crunching like boots on gravel. They were softer, dragging slightly, like someone trying not to make noise but not quite succeeding. The steps moved from the front of the van toward the back, then stopped. I felt the cold then, not from the air but from the certainty settling in my gut. Someone knew I was inside. I reached for my phone. No signal. Of course. Jawbone Canyon doesn't care about your bars or your emergency plans. I reached under the seat for the flashlight instead, fingers shaking as I wrapped them around the handle. Another sound followed, fingertips brushing metal, not knocking, tracing. The sensation crawled up my spine as the sound slid along the side of the van, slow and exploratory, like whoever it was memorizing the shape of my shelter, testing it. I wanted to shout, to ask what they wanted, to scare them off. I didn't. There's a moment in fear where instinct and ego collide. Instinct says hide, stay silent, survive. Ego says you're overreacting, don't embarrass yourself, don't look weak. I stayed quiet. The smell came back then, stronger. That same metallic sourness seeping through the cracked window like it had been waiting for the right moment. My stomach turned. I pressed the blanket over my mouth, trying not to breathe too deeply. Then the whisper came. Not words, not quite, more like breath shaped by teeth. Close enough to the van that I could hear the moisture in it. I squeezed my eyes shut, every muscle locked, my mind racing through possibilities I didn't want to consider. A lost hiker didn't move like this. A drunk off-roader didn't take their time. Whoever was outside wasn't in a hurry. Another knock followed. This one on the rear door. 2 taps. Pause, one more. Different rhythm, like a test. I knew then that staying silent wasn't keeping me safe. It was making me predictable. I flicked the flashlight on and aimed it at the side window, flooding the thin glass with light. "Hey," I shouted, my voice cracking despite my effort to steady it. "This is private. You need to leave." The footsteps stopped instantly. No retreat, no response. Just stillness so complete it felt staged. The light reflected back at me, useless against the darkness beyond the glass. My hand cramped around the flashlight as seconds stretched thin. That's when I saw the shadow shift, just barely, near the front of the van. Something tall, too tall to be crouching, standing close, very close. And then came the sound that finally broke my denial completely. A second set of footsteps, approaching from the opposite side. The second set of footsteps erased any remaining illusion that this was coincidence. They weren't synchronized. That's what terrified me most. One set stayed near the front of the van, barely moving, while the other approached from behind with slow, uneven steps. Stop. Drag. Stop. Like whoever it was had learned patience the hard way. The sound wrapped around the van, turning the thin metal walls into something fragile, temporary. I'd never felt so aware of how little separated me from whatever was out there. My mind did what it always did under pressure. It searched for rules, patterns, logic. 2 people meant coordination. Coordination meant intent. I lowered the flash, plunging the inside of the van back into darkness, and instantly regretted it. Without the light, the smells felt stronger, thicker, like the air itself had weight. My skin prickled with cold sweat despite the heater being off. I could hear my own heartbeat again, loud and arrhythmic, like it was trying to escape my chest before I did. A hand pressed against the side of the van, not pounding, not forcing, just resting there. The metal flexed slightly under the weight, and the sound it made, a low, tired creak, felt intimate. Too close. I imagined fingers splayed out there, palm flat, feeling the vibration of my breathing through the wall, knowing exactly where I was lying. I swallowed hard and forced myself to move. Staying frozen had gotten me here. I slid forward into the driver's seat as quietly as I could, every shift of fabric sounding like thunder in my own ears. The keys were already in the ignition. I always left them there at night. Habit. One of the few good ones I had. As I reached for them, a knock hit the windshield. Harder this time. Louder. My head snapped up, and for half a second I thought I saw a face, just a suggestion of one, pressed too close to the glass. Then it was gone, swallowed by the dark. The knock echoed in my bones, rattling the steering wheel, vibrating through the dashboard. The footsteps behind me moved closer to the rear doors. They were boxing me in. "Leave," I shouted again, louder now, desperation tearing through the word. "I'm calling the cops." The lie hung in the air, thin and useless. Even if I had signal, response time out here would be measured in hours, not minutes. Jawbone Canyon didn't belong to anyone once the sun went down. That was the truth I'd ignored when I chose this spot. No neighbors, no witnesses, no one to hear anything go wrong. The smell shifted, sharper now, like old blood left too long in the heat. I turned the key. The engine coughed once, then died. Panic surged so fast it stole my breath. I tried again, pumping the gas, whispering at the van like it could hear me. Come on. Come on. Another cough, another failure. Each second felt borrowed, slipping away while I sat there useless, surrounded. A scraping sound dragged along the roof. Something was on top of the van. I screamed then. I couldn't help it. The sound tore out of me raw and uncontrolled, filling the small space and bouncing back off the walls. It felt like an admission of weakness, like I'd crossed some invisible line and given them exactly what they wanted. The response was immediate. Laughter. Not loud, not mocking, just a low, breathy chuckle drifting down through the roof vents. It wasn't human in the way voices usually are. There was no warmth to it, no rhythm, just sound shaped by a throat that knew how to make it unsettling. That was the moment denial finally let go. I grabbed the flashlight again and flung open the driver's door, light cutting through the dark in a wild arc. Cold air rushed in, carrying dust and that awful smell with it. For a split second, the beam caught movement. Two figures just beyond the edge of the van's headlights. They were closer than I'd thought. Both tall, both standing wrong somehow, shoulders sloped forward, heads tilted at angles that made my neck ache just looking at them. I couldn't make out faces, just the suggestion of eyes reflecting back at me, too still, too focused. I slammed the door shut and locked it, hands shaking so badly I missed the latch the first time. The figures didn't rush me. They didn't retreat. They just waited. That was worse than any attack. The roof creaked again as weight shifted. The metal popped softly, protesting. I imagined hands gripping the edges, testing for weakness, for leverage. The van felt smaller with every second, like the walls were inching inward. I remembered something then, an old ranger I'd met years back in Anza Borrego talking about desert survival, how people underestimate it, how isolation doesn't scare you until it's too late. Out here, he'd said, trouble doesn't announce itself. It listens first. A loud bang exploded against the rear doors. I flinched, pain shooting through my shoulders. The bang came again, harder, followed by the rattle of the handle being pulled. Once, twice, 3 times in quick succession. The locks held, but the sound echoed like a countdown. I scrambled for anything I could use as a weapon, tire iron, knife, anything, and my hand closed around the small hatchet I kept tucked under the seat for firewood. It felt absurdly light in my grip. Insufficient. Another bang. The doors bowed inward, just a little. Open, a voice rasped from outside. The word was barely formed, like it hadn't been used much. It scraped along my nerves, carried on breath that smelled of rust and rot. No, I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was saying it to, them or myself. The roof shifted violently, a heavy thump landing near the front. The van rocked, suspension groaning under the sudden weight. Dust rained down from the ceiling seams, coating my hair, my face. My lungs burned as I sucked in air that tasted wrong. The engine chose that moment to roar to life. The sound was so sudden, so loud, it startled me into laughter, hysterical, half sobbing. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I just threw it into gear and slammed my foot down. The van lurched forward, tires spinning uselessly for a heartbeat before catching. Something slid off the roof with a dull thud, rolling out of sight. The rear doors shook one last time as the figures stumbled back, silhouettes breaking apart in the chaos. I didn't look. I drove blind, headlights slicing through dust and darkness, the canyon walls closing in as I bounced over ruts and rocks I hadn't noticed on the way in. The van protested with every impact, but it kept moving, carrying me away from that place like it knew what was at stake. In the rearview mirror, I saw them standing at the edge of the light, not chasing, not waving, just watching. Their shapes blurred as distance grew, then vanished entirely as the canyon swallowed them whole. The road stretched out ahead, endless and empty, but for the first time all night, the emptiness felt like mercy. I didn't stop driving until dawn broke the horizon, washing the desert in pale gold and revealing just how exposed Jawbone Canyon really was. Only then did my hands stop shaking. Only then did the weight of what had almost happened settle into something I could carry. Out there, isolation doesn't mean peace. It means vulnerability. It means no one hears the knocks but you. And when you answer, whatever's waiting already knows your name. I didn't stop driving when the sky turned pink. I didn't stop when the sun finally crested the ridge and spilled light across the desert like nothing terrible had ever happened there. I kept going because stopping felt like surrender, like if I let the van rest, whatever I'd left behind might catch up in the quiet spaces between breaths. By the time I pulled into a gas station on the outskirts of Mojave, my hands were locked stiff around the steering wheel. I sat there long after the engine was off, staring through the windshield at a world that suddenly felt too open, too exposed. The smell was still on me, dust, sweat, and that metallic edge I couldn't scrub out of my nose no matter how deeply I inhaled. I washed my face in the bathroom sink, watching the water run brown at first, then clear. The man staring back at me in the mirror looked older than the one who'd driven into Jawbone Canyon the day before. His eyes kept flicking to the door, like he expected someone to knock. That sound followed me for weeks. 3 slow taps, even spacing, metal answering back. I told myself over and over that I'd survived because I stayed calm, because I acted when I had to. But the truth settled in slowly, uncomfortably. I survived because I got lucky, because the engine started when it did, because whoever or whatever was out there didn't feel the need to finish things. That realization changed how I camped, changed how I listened. Months later, I found myself parked at another desert site, farther north, the van positioned carefully with clear sightlines in every direction. I left no windows cracked, no assumptions unchecked. When the night sounds came, and they always do, I didn't rush to explain them away. I let unease sit where it belonged, as a signal, not a weakness. Jawbone Canyon taught me something no guidebook ever could. Out there, isolation doesn't mean you're alone. It means you're unheard. And the desert doesn't protect you. It observes. It waits. It presses close and listens to see whether you'll listen back. Because sometimes the knock isn't asking permission. It's letting you know you've already been found. The ocean doesn't sound peaceful at night. It sounds like something massive breathing just beyond the edge of your understanding. My name is Evan Calder. I was 36 years old when this happened, and I had been living out of my 1987 Volkswagen Vanagon for nearly 8 months by then. Not full-time escape, more like a slow retreat. I grew up inland, the kind of place where land stretches wide and forgiving, and I'd always believed the coast was where things made sense, where you could look at the horizon and feel small in a good way. In March of that year, I was drifting north along Highway 1, hugging the California coastline like it might hold me together if I stayed close enough. It was 2:30 in the morning when I pulled into the turnout. I hadn't planned to stop there. I told myself I was tired, that my eyes were burning from too many hours on the road, that the Vanagon's engine temperature needle had twitched a little too high climbing the last grade. All of those things were true. But there was another reason I didn't admit until much later. Something about the dark ahead of me felt expectant, like the road was waiting for me to continue. The turnout sat just south of Big Sur proper, a narrow patch of cracked asphalt pressed between the cliff wall and nothing at all. No guardrail, just air, then blackness, then the Pacific far below, unseen but loud. I angled the van so the nose faced inland, habit drilled into me from too many nights sleeping in strange places. Escape route matters more than views. When I shut the engine off, the silence rushed in so fast it felt physical. Not quiet. Never quiet on the coast, but empty of anything human. The wind moved through scrub and twisted cypress behind me, scraping like fingernails across dry bark. Salt hung thick in the air, metallic and damp, clinging to the back of my throat. I remember thinking how wrong it felt to be alone there. I cracked the window an inch, enough to let the air move, and lay back on the bench seat. The Vanagon rocked gently, responding to gusts that came off the cliff face like sudden exhalations. I told myself I'd close my eyes for 10 minutes, just enough to reset. That was when I heard the footsteps. At first, they were indistinguishable from the wind, soft, irregular sounds against the pavement. I didn't sit up right away. Big Sur attracts night hikers, photographers chasing moonlight on water, couples who think isolation is romantic. I'd parked at turnouts like this dozens of times before. Then the steps stopped, not faded, not drifted away. Stopped, directly outside my van. I held my breath without meaning to. The smell inside the van shifted, the faint warmth of old upholstery mixing with cold ocean air and something else. Damp earth, maybe, or rust. A shape moved past my windshield, blocking what little starlight there was. Slow, close enough that I could see the outline of shoulders, the slope of a head. Whoever it was didn't look in, didn't peer through the glass the way curious strangers usually do. He stood perfectly still. I told myself to call out, to clear my throat, say something casual. "Hey, you all right?" That's what normal people do. But there was a pressure building in my chest, a quiet internal resistance that felt like pushing against a memory I didn't want to name. Years earlier, I'd ignored a similar feeling in a rest stop outside Bakersfield. That night ended with a smashed window and a stranger's breath too close to my face before I managed to drive off. Denial is easier than fear. Denial lets you lie still and hope the problem solves itself. The footsteps resumed, slower now, circling the van. Gravel crunched under his weight near the rear tire. I could feel it through the floor, vibrations traveling up into my spine. He brushed against the side panel, lightly, almost absent-mindedly. The metal responded with a dull, hollow sound. Tap, then another. Tap, tap, not a knock, not a test, a rhythm. My pulse matched it before I realized what was happening. I reached forward, fingers hovering over the keys in the ignition, careful not to jostle them. The Vanagon always started rough in cold air. I pictured the engine coughing, the delay stretching too long. Outside, the tapping stopped. A voice spoke, so close it felt like it came from inside my head. "You picked a dangerous place to sleep." It was calm, male, not threatening in tone. That made it worse. I sat up slowly, my movements deliberate, trying to see through the side mirror. All I caught was darkness and a suggestion of movement, this fast like a shadow shifting independently of its source. "I'm leaving," I said. My voice sounded smaller than I expected, swallowed by the space around us. There was a pause, then a soft sound, almost a laugh, but without warmth. "Road's not safe this time of night." My instincts screamed then, loud enough to cut through the fog I had wrapped myself in. People don't warn strangers at 2:30 a.m. without wanting something. And they don't stand where you can't see their face unless they don't want you to. I turned the key. The engine groaned. Once, twice. My stomach dropped. Outside footsteps moved again, faster now toward the front of the van. I slammed the key forward a third time. The engine caught with a shudder, roaring to life too loud in the narrow turnout. Headlights flared, washing the asphalt and cliff wall in harsh white. He was standing directly in front of the van, not 10 feet away. He was tall, thinner than he should have been, his clothes hanging off him like they'd been soaked and left to dry on his body. His face was pale, unnaturally so, and his eyes reflected the headlights in a way that reminded me of animals caught on the roadside. But he didn't squint, didn't flinch. He smiled. It wasn't a threatening smile. It was tired, sad even, the kind you give when you know something the other person doesn't. "You don't remember this stretch," he said, raising a hand, not to stop me, but as if greeting an old friend. My foot hovered over the gas. Every rational thought told me to drive, to swerve if I had to. But another part of me, the part that always needed to understand, hesitated. "I've driven it before," I said. His smile widened just a fraction. "No," he replied softly. "You haven't driven past it." The wind surged then, hard enough to rock the van, and for a split second the headlights flickered. When they steadied, the space in front of me was empty, no footsteps retreating, no sound of movement. Just the road, stretching north into darkness, and the ocean below roaring louder than before, like it approved of something I hadn't yet done. I didn't wait. I slammed the gas and pulled back onto Highway 1, heart hammering, hands shaking so badly I could barely keep the van centered between the lines. But as the turnout disappeared in my mirrors, a certainty settled over me, heavy and cold. Whatever I'd just encountered hadn't been trying to stop me from leaving. It had been warning me that leaving wasn't the same thing as escaping. The road narrowed as I climbed north, the yellow lines wavering like they were being pulled into the dark ahead of me. And no matter how hard I focused on the pavement, I couldn't shake the feeling that something in the van had changed. Not moved, not broken. Changed, like a room after an argument when the furniture is in the same place but the air remembers what was said. I kept driving longer than I should have, past the point where fatigue turned into something sharper, more dangerous. My eyes burned, my jaw ached from clenching it, and every sound the Vanagon made felt amplified. The rattle of loose trim, the low whine of the tires on uneven asphalt, the soft thud as the suspension absorbed the road's scars. Normally those sounds grounded me. That night, they felt like tells, like the van was nervous too. I told myself I'd pull over at the next proper campground. Something marked. Something with a name. But Big Sur doesn't offer comfort on command. Turnouts came and went, each one darker than the last, each one whispering the same unspoken invitation I'd refused only minutes before. That was when the smell started. At first it was faint, buried beneath salt air and old upholstery, a sweetness that didn't belong. Rotting kelp can smell sweet if it's warm enough, and for a few miles I convinced myself that's what it was, some unseen pile down the cliff carried up by the wind. But the smell didn't fade. It thickened. It crept forward from the back of the van, curling around my seat like damp fingers. I checked the mirrors again, more out of habit than fear, and that's when I noticed the condensation. The windows had fogged over from the inside. I hadn't been breathing hard. The night air was cold enough that the glass should have stayed clear. I wiped the driver's side window with my sleeve, smearing a half moon into the fog, and the smell surged, strong enough now that my eyes watered. "Get a grip," I muttered, but the words sounded wrong in my mouth, like I was repeating something I'd been told rather than something I believed. The radio crackled to life. I hadn't turned it on. Static filled the van, low and uneven, rising and falling like surf. I reached for the knob, my fingers brushing cold plastic, and for a moment the static resolved into something else, a voice buried deep, stretched thin by distance. This stretch. I twisted the dial hard. The radio went silent again, but the smell lingered, cloying and wrong. That's when I felt it. A shift in weight. Not dramatic, not enough to rock the van. Just a subtle change, like someone settling more comfortably in a seat. My hands tightened on the wheel. My breathing went shallow, careful. I didn't look back. Some instinct older than reason told me that turning around would make whatever this was real in a way I couldn't undo. "You're not real," I said, because denial is a reflex, and reflexes don't need logic. From somewhere behind me, close enough that I felt it against my ear, a voice answered. "Neither are you," it said. The temperature dropped so fast it felt like a pressure change. My breath fogged in front of me, thick clouds forming with each exhale. The smell shifted again, less sweet now, more metallic, like old blood washed thin by seawater. I swerved. The van drifted toward the edge before I corrected, tires screaming in protest. My heart slammed against my ribs, panic finally punching through whatever barrier I'd tried to build. "I'm not stopping," I said, louder this time. "I don't care what you want." There was a pause. Then the sound of fabric moving. A slow inhale that wasn't mine. "I don't want you to stop," the voice said. "I want you to remember." Images flooded my mind without warning. Headlights cutting through fog, the sickening lurch of a vehicle losing traction, the sound of metal tearing against rock. I tasted salt and copper, felt the phantom of impact ripple through my bones. I gasped, my vision blurring. "I've never crashed here," I said, though the certainty I'd once had was gone, replaced by something brittle and uncertain. Behind me, a soft sound. Approval, maybe. "Not this time," the voice agreed. The road ahead curved sharply, disappearing behind a wall of rock. I took it slower than I should have, fear tightening my muscles, and as I rounded the bend, my headlights caught something that made my stomach drop. Another turnout. Unmarked, unlit, empty, except for a shape standing at its edge. Tall, thin, familiar. He didn't step into the road, didn't raise a hand. He just watched me pass, his face illuminated for a heartbeat by my headlights. The same tired smile, the same eyes reflecting too much light. And then he was gone. The van lurched as if something heavy had been lifted from it. The smell faded, replaced by cold, clean air. The fog on the windows thinned, then vanished altogether. I didn't slow down until the first hint of dawn crept into the sky, a bruised purple bleeding into gray over the ocean. I pulled into a proper campground just north of Pfeiffer Big Sur State Park, one with signage and gravel and the distant glow of other RVs tucked into their spaces like sleeping animals. I sat there for a long time after turning the engine off, hands resting uselessly in my lap, listening to my heartbeat slowly find a normal rhythm. Sleep didn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that turnout, felt the weight shift behind me, heard that voice whispering truths I wasn't ready to own. By morning, I told myself a story I could live with. Fatigue, stress, the coast playing tricks on a tired mind. I made coffee, watched the fog burn off the trees, nodded politely at a couple walking their dog. But as I packed up to leave, I noticed something that unraveled all of it. On the inside of the rear window, traced through dust and condensation I couldn't explain, were faint fingerprints. Too long, too narrow, and they were facing outward. I didn't camp along that stretch of coast again. I still travel. I still sleep in the Vanagon. But there are places I pass without stopping now, no matter how tired I am, no matter how inviting the turnout looks in the dark. Because some warnings don't come from the living, and some roads remember you, whether you remember them or not. I left the campground just after sunrise, the kind of pale coastal morning that feels borrowed, like it doesn't quite belong to the day yet. Fog hung low between the redwoods, drifting slow and deliberate, and for the first time since the night before, the world looked ordinary enough to trust. That normalcy unsettled me more than the darkness had. Horror announces itself in obvious ways. Calm asks you to doubt your own memory. As I eased the Vanagon back onto Highway 1, I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him sitting there, folded into the back seat like he'd always been part of the van. But the seats were empty. The air was clean, no smell, no weight, just the low hum of the engine and the muted rush of tires on asphalt. Still, something stayed with me, a residue. Not fear exactly. Fear fades. This was heavier, like learning a secret you can't unknow. The road curved inland for a while, pulling me away from the cliff's edge. Sunlight filtered through trees, striping the windshield in gold and shadow. I told myself this was the reset point, that whatever had happened belonged to the night, and daylight had rules the dark couldn't follow. That belief lasted until I reached the first overlook north of Big Sur. I didn't plan to stop. I swear that. My foot lifted off the gas on its own, the van slowing as if responding to something beneath conscious thought. The turnout was wider than the others, bordered by a low stone wall that kept you from stepping straight into nothing. A weathered sign leaned crooked near the edge, its lettering bleached almost white by sun and salt. I parked and sat there, engine idling, arguing silently with myself. You're awake now. You're fine. Don't do this. I shut the engine off anyway. The ocean stretched out below, steel blue and endless, its surface broken by white scars where waves struck rock. From this height, the sound carried up delayed and distorted, a low thunder that seemed to come from inside my chest rather than the water itself. I stepped out of the van. The air was cold enough to sting my lungs. The smell of salt was sharp, clean, nothing like the sweetness from the night before. I walked to the stone wall and rested my hands on it, feeling the grit of lichen under my palms. That's when I saw the plaque. It was set into the stone, small and easy to miss. Bronze, darkened with age. I leaned closer, my stomach tightening before I even read the words. In memory of those lost along this stretch of coast. No names, no dates. Just that. Behind the plaque, someone had left flowers, old ones. Stems brittle, petals browned and curled in on themselves like they'd been there longer than they should have. Among them sat a single object that didn't belong. An old key, worn smooth, tied to a faded strip of red cloth. My breath caught. I'd seen that cloth before. It took me a second to place it, the image rising reluctantly like my mind was trying to protect me from itself. Then it clicked, the man's wrist, the way the fabric had hung loose against his skin when he lifted his hand in front of my van. I stepped back, heart pounding, and that's when the sound came. Footsteps. Not behind me. Beside me. I didn't turn. I couldn't. The part of me that still believed in rules, physical rules, human rules, knew that if I turned and saw him in daylight, something final would break. "You came back," he said. His voice was different now, less hollow, more grounded, like the ocean when it pulls back just before a wave hits. "I didn't mean to," I replied, staring out at the water. My hands shook where they rested on the stone. I just stopped. "That's how it happens," he said. "You don't decide. The road does." I swallowed hard. "What do you want from me?" There was a long pause. Wind moved through the grass behind us, bending it all in the same direction like the land itself was listening. "I want you to stop pretending this was random," he said finally. Images stirred again, slower this time, more deliberate. A different night. Years ago. Rain on pavement. A coastal road I shouldn't have been on, driving too fast because I was angry, because I needed the motion to drown something out. I remembered the skid, the guardrail rushing up, the sound of impact echoing through metal and bone. I'd survived that crash, walked away with scars and a story I told like a joke at parties. But I hadn't been alone. "There was someone else," I whispered. "Yes," he said gently. "There always is." The weight of that settled into me, pressing down until my knees threatened to give. I'd buried that night under years of rationalization, blaming weather, blaming road conditions, blaming youth. I'd never let myself sit with the truth long enough for it to take shape. "What are you?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was softer than the wind. "I'm what's left when a place doesn't let go." I turned then, slowly, carefully. He stood at the edge of the turnout, close enough that I could see the details daylight had hidden, the way his clothes were faded into indistinct shades like color had slowly drained from them, the faint bruising beneath his eyes, the red cloth, frayed and thin, tied around his wrist like a marker. "You don't belong here," I said, though the words felt inadequate. A sad smile touched his mouth. "Neither do you," he replied, "but you keep coming back." I thought of all the nights I'd chosen roads over rest, movement over stillness, of how I'd chased horizons instead of facing what waited behind me. RV life had felt like freedom, but maybe it had also been avoidance. "What happens now?" I asked. He looked past me, toward the van, toward the road stretching north. "That depends," he said. "Some people hear the warning, some don't." The ocean roared louder, a sudden surge of sound that rattled the stone beneath my hands. When it faded, the space beside me was empty. No footsteps, no voice, just the wind and the distant crash of waves. I stood there for a long time after that until the sun climbed higher and the chill eased from the air. When I finally returned to the van, I noticed something tucked beneath the windshield wiper. The red cloth. Clean, dry. Real. I didn't touch it. I left it there when I drove away, watching it flutter once, then tear free and tumble across the turnout, coming to rest near the plaque before the wind carried it over the edge. I still drive Highway 1. I still camp along the coast. But I don't stop at unmarked turnouts anymore. And when night falls and fatigue whispers that one more mile won't hurt, I listen differently now. Because not everyone you meet on California's coast belongs to the living world. And some of them aren't there to harm you. Some of them are there to remind you that the road remembers what you're trying to forget. And that survival, real survival, isn't just about escaping the dark. It's about facing what follows you into the light. The desert was already watching us before I realized I was afraid. My name is Elliot Harper. I was 38 that summer, and I had convinced myself I knew California well enough to stop respecting it. I grew up in Riverside County, learned to drive on sun-cracked highways, learned early that wide open land made you feel brave, even when it shouldn't. I'd been RV camping for over a decade by then, mostly solo, sometimes with my younger sister Maren, riding shotgun in my old Volkswagen Rialta, the kind that rattles like loose teeth when the wind gets serious. Joshua Tree was supposed to be easy, a quick escape. No reservations, just BLM land outside the park boundary, nothing official, nothing crowded. We rolled in just after sunset, the sky burning itself out in layers of orange and ash. The air still held heat, thick and unmoving, like the day hadn't finished speaking yet. That should have been my first warning, the way the desert refused to cool down. We parked in a shallow basin ringed with boulders that looked stacked on purpose, like someone had arranged them and walked away. No campfire. Too dry. Just the RV engine ticking as it cooled, the sound sharp and lonely. I remember thinking how quiet it felt, not peaceful, just empty. Like sound itself didn't want to stay there long. Maren asked if we should move closer to the road. I said no. I always said no. I liked feeling hidden. I told myself the unease I felt was just the desert messing with depth perception, with shadows that didn't behave. I'd camped in worse places. I'd slept through storms, through coyotes circling, through strangers walking too close to the reg at night. This was nothing. That was denial talking. I didn't know it yet. By midnight, the heat finally cracked and the cold came fast, sharp enough to raise goosebumps. The smell of dust changed too, metallic, almost wet like rain that never comes. I stepped outside to take a leak, flashlight dangling uselessly at my side because the moon was bright enough to make shadows feel intentional. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, not crunching, not sliding, measured, slow, coming from somewhere beyond the rocks. I froze, half-zipped, heart climbing into my throat. I stood there listening, trying to convince myself it was an echo, or my own movement bouncing back wrong. Joshua Tree does that. Sound bends, lies. But these steps didn't stop when I did. They paused, then shifted, like whatever it was had noticed me noticing it. I finished quickly, back toward the RV without turning around. The cold metal of the door handle felt like relief. I didn't tell Maren. She was already asleep, curled under a thin blanket, breathing shallow. I told myself there was no threat if I couldn't define one. Inside, the RV felt smaller than it ever had. The walls creaked as the temperature dropped, and every sound carried too clearly. I lay awake listening to the wind move through the Joshua trees, their stiff branches rubbing together, making a dry clicking sound that almost matched the rhythm of footsteps. At 1:12 a.m., the knocking started. 3 taps, slow, deliberate. Not loud enough to be urgent, not soft enough to ignore. I held my breath, counting the seconds between knocks. There were exactly 5, then 3 more taps. Maren stirred. "El?" she whispered. "Stay quiet," I said, my voice already betraying me. Another knock. This one lower, closer to the wheel well. That didn't make sense. People knock at eye level. Animals scratch. This was neither. I reached for the flashlight, my hand shaking enough that it clattered against the cabinet. The knocking stopped immediately. Silence pressed in so hard my ears rang. I told myself if it were a person, they'd speak. Ask for help. If it were an animal, it wouldn't wait. That logic felt thin even as I leaned on it. Minutes passed. 10, maybe more. The cold seeped through the floor, through my bones. Just when my body began to unclench, just when my brain tried to reset. Something brushed the side of the RV. Not bumped, brushed. A dragging contact, slow and exploratory like fingers testing a surface. Maren grabbed my arm. I could feel her pulse through her sleeve. "El," she said again, louder now. I moved without thinking, sliding into the driver's seat, hands fumbling for the keys. The engine turned over once, then stalled. My stomach dropped so hard I thought I might be sick. Outside, something exhaled. I don't mean breathed. I mean exhaled, long, controlled, right near the driver's side window. I started the engine again, this time pressing the gas harder than I should have. The RV roared to life, headlights snapping on and flooding the basin with harsh white light. There was nothing there. No person. No animal. No shadow moving away. Just rocks. Joshua trees standing stiff and accusing. Tire tracks that ended where we sat. I didn't hesitate. I threw the rig into gear and drove, headlights bouncing wildly as we jolted over uneven ground. The road felt farther than it had before, like the desert had stretched itself while we weren't looking. Marin didn't speak. She just stared out the window, her reflection pale and doubled in the glass. In the side mirror, for just a second, I thought I saw movement keeping pace with us. Too smooth, too steady for the terrain. I told myself it was dust. It had to be dust. We reached the paved road and didn't stop until the first gas station lights burned our eyes. I parked under them, hands locked on the wheel, chest aching from how long I'd been holding my breath. That should have been the end of it. But as the engine ticked and cooled again, the smell came back. That same metallic, rainless scent. And I realized something terrible. The feeling hadn't stayed behind in the desert. It was still with us. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. Even parked under fluorescent lights with a security camera humming overhead, my body refused to believe we were safe. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that exhale again. Controlled, intentional, too close to be coincidence. Joshua Tree wasn't loud about its threats. It whispered them, and it let your own mind finish the job. Marin finally dozed off sometime after 3, curled up with her knees drawn tight, like she was trying to make herself smaller. I stayed in the driver's seat, watching the mirrors, the glass doors of the gas station, the empty stretch of highway beyond the pumps. Nothing moved except moths throwing themselves against light like it owed them something. At dawn, the desert looked innocent again. That's what unsettled me most. Soft pink sky, calm air, no sign of whatever had pressed itself against our RV hours earlier. I almost laughed at myself, almost convinced myself it was exhaustion, heat, imagination fueled by isolation. Almost. We drove deeper into town for breakfast, and that's when the first thing didn't make sense. The smell followed us. Not diesel, not oil. That same cold metal scent, faint but unmistakable like damp pennies rubbed together. It clung to the inside of the RV no matter how many windows I opened. The air outside was clean, sharp with morning chill, but inside felt wrong, stale in a way fresh air couldn't fix. Marin noticed it too. I could tell by the way she kept sniffing the air, her jaw tightening. "You smell that?" she finally asked. "Probably the tank," I said too quickly. She didn't argue, which scared me more than if she had. Marin was practical. She didn't jump to fear. If she'd felt safe enough to dismiss it, she would have. At a diner off the highway, an old place with cracked vinyl booths and windows clouded by decades of sun, we sat in silence longer than was comfortable. The waitress poured coffee and lingered, her eyes flicking to our RV visible through the window. "You folks camp out by the park?" she asked. I nodded. Her smile faded just a fraction. "Inside the grounds or out on BLM?" "BLM," I said, "just overnight." She set the pot down slower than necessary. "Lot of land out there," she said. "Not all of it likes company." That was it. No warning, no elaboration. She walked away like she'd said nothing at all. I wanted to laugh it off, but my hands were shaking too badly to lift the mug. We left Joshua Tree by mid-morning, telling ourselves we were heading west toward the coast, somewhere cool, somewhere crowded, somewhere real. The highway stretched long and empty, heat already starting to rise in visible waves. With every mile, I expected the pressure in my chest to ease. It didn't. About an hour out, the RV began to feel heavy. Not mechanically, emotionally, like the air itself had thickened. The radio crackled with static, even on strong stations, voices warping into slow, dragging tones before cutting out altogether. When I turned it off, the silence felt worse. Marin broke it then. "Elle, what if it didn't want the campsite?" I glanced at her. "What do you mean?" "What if it wanted us?" The words sat between us, ugly and undeniable. I wanted to tell her she was letting fear spiral, that the desert messes with people, that there was no such thing as a presence that could follow you miles beyond where it lived. But every instinct I'd ignored the night before was screaming now, louder than reason. We stopped at a rest area near midday. Bad decision. I knew at the moment the tires crunched onto gravel. The place was empty. No cars, no voices, just concrete tables baking in the sun and a single restroom building humming faintly with electricity. The air smelled wrong again. Stronger now, almost sweet beneath the metal. Marin stayed in the RV. I told her I just needed to check the tires. I lied. As soon as my feet hit the ground, the desert pressed in. Not visually, emotionally, like standing too close to someone angry but silent. The Joshua trees were gone now, replaced by scrub and open land, but the feeling was the same. I walked a slow circle around the RV. On the passenger side panel, just below the window where I'd heard that exhale, there were marks. Not scratches, not dents. Smears. Long, uneven streaks in the dust, darker than the rest, as if something warm had dragged itself along the metal. My stomach turned when I realized the height was wrong. Too high for an animal, too low for a person standing upright. Something that moved, close to the ground. My mouth went dry. Behind me, gravel shifted. I spun around, heart slamming, but the lot was empty. No wind, no movement. Just that low electrical hum from the restroom building, suddenly loud in the silence. That's when I heard it again. Footsteps. Clear this time. Slow. Measured. Coming from behind the building. I backed toward the RV, eyes locked on the corner of the structure. Every rational part of my brain screamed at me to call out, to demand whoever it was show themselves. But something deeper, older, knew that acknowledgement was an invitation. The footsteps stopped. Then came the sound of dragging. Not heavy, not clumsy, intentional. My chest tightened so hard it hurt. I fumbled for the door, keys digging into my palm. I didn't look back when I climbed inside and slammed it shut. "Drive," Marin said, already bracing herself. I didn't argue. I floored it, tires spitting gravel as we tore back onto the highway. In the mirror, dust billowed and settled. There was still nothing there. We didn't stop again until sunset, pushing ourselves farther west than planned. By the time the sky darkened, exhaustion had wrapped itself around my thoughts like fog. I told myself we couldn't outrun fear forever. That eventually, logic would reassert itself. We pulled into a crowded RV park near civilization. Hookups, lights, other rigs close enough to hear generators and muffled conversations. Safety in numbers. That night, I almost believed we were done with it. Almost. Sometime after midnight, the temperature dropped sharply. I woke to cold creeping through the floor, through my spine. The smell was back, stronger than ever, and then, soft, unmistakable, 3 slow taps on the side of the RV. Not loud, not urgent, patient. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, understanding, settling to my bones with awful clarity. It hadn't followed us because it was angry. It had followed us because we'd stayed long enough for it to learn us, and now it knew where we slept. I didn't move when the knocking came back. I didn't even breathe. The RV park was alive with quiet human noise, generators humming, someone's TV murmuring through thin walls, a dog barking far off and then stopping. All the sounds that were supposed to mean safety, normalcy. Proof that the world was still operating by familiar rules. The tapping didn't care. 3 knocks, same spacing, same patience. Marin's hand found mine in the dark, her fingers ice cold and shaking. She didn't whisper my name this time. She already knew what it was, or at least what it wasn't. I slid out of bed slowly, every movement deliberate, terrified of provoking whatever was on the other side. The smell was overwhelming now, coppery, damp, wrong, like something that belonged underground had found its way into the open and brought its environment with it. I pressed my ear to the wall. Nothing. No breathing. No shifting weight. Just the absence of sound, heavy enough to feel intentional. That's when the realization hit me, sharp and nauseating. It wasn't knocking to get in. It was knocking to let us know it was still there. I stepped back, pulse roaring in my ears. Outside, footsteps began to move again, slow and circling. Not crunching gravel this time. Barely making noise at all, like whatever it was had learned how to walk softer. I glanced at the window. A shadow passed over it. not blocking the light completely, just dimming it slightly like a cloud crossing the moon. Too tall to be on all fours, too low to be fully upright. My stomach dropped. Marin sucked in a breath that sounded like it might turn into a scream. I covered her mouth without thinking, my own fear overriding any sense of gentleness. Her eyes were wide, glassy, fixed on the window. The shadow stopped moving. Then came the smell again, stronger, almost sweet now, like rot masked by rain. I did the only thing I hadn't tried yet. I spoke. "Go away," I said, my voice barely holding together. "We're leaving. We don't belong here." The words felt stupid the moment they left my mouth, but they were honest. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then from right outside the wall came a sound I will never forget. It wasn't a growl, not a hiss, not anything so simple. It was a mimicry of breath, an imitation, like something that had listened to people long enough to know the rhythm but not the meaning. Inhale. Pause. Exhale. Too slow. Too deliberate. My knees went weak. Whatever followed us from Joshua Tree wasn't lost. It was curious. The footsteps resumed, moving toward the rear of the RV, then stopping again. I imagined it standing there, tilted, listening to our heartbeats through thin walls and insulation, learning. That's when anger broke through the fear. A sharp, reckless defiance. I grabbed the keys. The engine roared to life, loud and sudden in the stillness. Outside, something scraped hard against the back panel. Not an attack, more like surprise. Like we'd interrupted it mid-thought. I didn't hesitate. I threw the RV into gear and lurched forward, horn blaring as we tore through the park. Lights flashed on a nearby rigs. Doors opened. Voices shouted in confusion. In the chaos, I checked the mirrors. For one terrible second, I saw it clearly. Not a shape that made sense, not something I could describe cleanly, just a wrongness moving between the parked RVs, too fluid, too quiet, slipping through shadows where there shouldn't have been space. And then it was gone. We didn't stop until dawn painted the sky pale and unconvincing. We parked at a busy truck stop miles away, surrounded by semis and diesel fumes and human exhaustion. I sat there long after the engine shut off, hands locked on the wheel, waiting for the smell. It didn't come back. That should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like permission. We drove straight home that morning. Didn't speak much. Didn't try to process it. Some experiences resist explanation, not because they're supernatural, but because they expose something we'd rather not examine. The idea that the land doesn't exist for us, that we are guests who overstay without realizing the cost. In the weeks that followed, I scrubbed the RV inside and out. The smears were gone, but the memory of them wasn't. I stopped camping on unmanaged land, stopped assuming isolation meant peace. I learned to listen to that first quiet flicker of unease instead of smothering it with pride and experience. Marin won't camp anymore, not anywhere remote. She says some places feel like they're still watching you even after you leave. I understand what she means. Joshua Tree didn't chase us because it was hostile. It followed us because we ignored the subtle ways it told us we didn't belong there overnight. Because some places in California were shaped by time and silence long before we arrived, with engines and confidence and thin walls between us and the dark. The desert doesn't need to attack you. It just needs you to stay long enough to forget you're not welcome. And once it learns you, it doesn't always let go. The road felt wrong long before I understood why. I remember that thought arriving quietly, not as panic, not even as fear, just a small pressure behind my ribs, like a warning I didn't want to hear. I was driving my old Volkswagen camper, the kind with chipped paint and a smell of dust and oil that never quite leaves the upholstery, heading north of Redding toward the edges of the Trinity Alps wilderness. My name's Elliot Mercer. I was 38 then. And I'd been camping alone for most of my adult life because solitude had always felt safer than people. People disappointed you. Places usually didn't. It was November, just after 6:40 p.m., and the light was draining out of the sky in long, bruised streaks of purple and gray. The mountains rose like dark thoughts on either side of the narrow road, trees packed so tightly they seemed to lean inward as if listening. I'd planned to stay at a small, documented campground I'd visited once years before. Nothing remote, nothing risky. That was the lie I kept repeating to myself as the GPS signal started to flicker. I told myself it was normal. Mountains do that. Forests swallow signals. I'd driven this van through worse. Utah deserts, Arizona canyons, half-forgotten backroads in Oregon where the silence pressed so hard it made your ears ring. But this felt different. The road narrowed without warning. The asphalt lost its clean edge and started crumbling into dirt, then gravel. No sign announcing the change. No entering Forest Service road marker. Just decay. I slowed instinctively. The engine's hum dropped into a low, uneasy growl, and the headlights carved narrow tunnels through the trees. That's when I noticed the smell. It wasn't the clean sharp of pine or damp earth. It was sour, metallic, like old rain soaked into rust. I cracked the window, thinking something in the engine might be overheating, but the smell got worse, crawling into the van like a living thing. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel. I told myself it was just my imagination, amplified by dusk and fatigue. Denial is a powerful companion on lonely roads. A mile later, the GPS went black. Not frozen, not searching, just dead. The screen reflected my face back at me, eyes tired, jaw tight, and for the first time I felt truly alone. No service bars, no reassuring blue dot, just me, the van, and a road that hadn't existed on my map. I should have turned around then. That's the moment I replay now, over and over. But the road curved sharply, trees hemming in so close that backing up felt impossible. And then I saw it. A wooden sign, hand-painted, half-rotted at the base, leaning like it had grown tired of standing. My headlights washed over the words, River's End Campground, 2 miles, no official seal, no Forest Service emblem, just those words, carved deep and uneven like someone had pressed too hard with the blade. Relief washed through me so fast it almost felt like gratitude. A campground meant people, or at least the possibility of them. Structure, safety. I laughed once, short and sharp, the sound bouncing too loudly inside the van. See? I muttered to no one. You're fine. The road dipped steeply after that, spiraling downward. The temperature dropped fast enough that I noticed it through my jacket. The heater blew, but the air stayed cold, damp, crawling along my skin. The trees changed too. Thicker, darker, their branches tangled overhead like interlocked fingers. The smell shifted again, heavier now, tinged with something organic and sweet in a way that made my stomach tighten. That's when the sound started. At first, it was just the wind, or what I thought was wind. A low moaning that rose and fell, threading through the trees. Then it sharpened, took shape, a rhythm, 3 short knocks spaced evenly apart. Knock, knock, knock. I slowed almost to a crawl, heart ticking louder than the engine. The sound wasn't coming from the van. It wasn't mechanical. It came from the forest itself, repeating, moving, echoing off trunks and rocks in a way that made direction impossible to pin down. Animals, I told myself, woodpeckers, branches, anything but what my instincts were whispering. The road opened suddenly into a clearing, and my headlights fell across a small campground, too small. 6 sites, maybe 7, arranged in a rough circle around a fire pit filled with blackened stones. No ranger station, no posted rules, no bulletin board with maps and emergency numbers, just empty pads, cracked concrete, and one structure at the far edge that might have been a restroom once. No other vehicles. That relief I'd felt earlier curdled into something else. Suspicion. A slow, creeping awareness that this place wasn't abandoned, it was waiting. The silence was thick, pressing against my ears, broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine when I finally shut it off. The moment the headlights died, the darkness surged forward, swallowing the edges of the clearing. My breath fogged in front of my face. I sat there longer than I should have, keys still in the ignition, listening. The knocks came again, closer this time, but softer, as if whoever, or whatever, didn't want to be heard. I debated leaving, turning the van around, grinding my way back up that narrow road in the dark. But fear has a way of disguising itself as practicality. I was tired. The road looked worse behind me than ahead, and I'd spent years telling myself I trusted my judgment. I picked the site closest to the exit. As I stepped out of the van, the cold hit me hard, sharper than before, biting through denim and boots. The ground felt spongy underfoot, damp in a way that suggested it never really dried. My flashlight beam jittered as my hand shook, catching glimpses of things that didn't sit right. Scratches in the bark of nearby trees, too high up to be animal. Old firewood stacked neatly, as if someone had just stepped away. I set up quickly, movements clipped and efficient. I'd done this hundreds of times. Muscle memory carried me through while my mind stayed locked on the forest line, watching shadows shift where nothing should have been moving. The smell lingered, stronger now, seeping into my clothes. When the knocking started again, it came from directly behind me. I spun, flashlight slicing through darkness, but there was nothing there. Just trees. Just the faint outline of the restroom building, its door hanging crooked on rusted hinges. And then I heard something that froze me where I stood. A voice. Not clear words, just a sound shaped like one, a low, breathy murmur that rose and fell, almost forming my name. Almost. It came from the direction of the other campsites, empty and dark. I didn't answer. I don't know if that was courage or fear, but I stayed silent, listening as my heart hammered so hard it made me lightheaded. The voice stopped. The silence that followed was worse. Heavy, expectant. That was when I realized something else that should have been obvious from the start. There were no insects, no crickets, no distant owl calls, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. The forest around River's End Campground was holding its breath, and somewhere deep inside me, a truth I'd been avoiding finally surfaced. I wasn't lost. I'd been led. I stood there, alone in the cold, flashlight trembling in my hand, knowing with a sick certainty that staying the night here was a mistake, but not yet understanding how much that mistake was about to cost me. I told myself I'd sleep in the driver's seat with the engine ready, keys in my hand, like that would somehow protect me from a place that already felt inside my head. I climbed back into the Volkswagen and locked the doors, the click sounding too loud, too final. The interior smelled like oil, old fabric, and my own sweat now, sharp with fear. I pulled the curtains closed but left a thin gap at the front, just enough to watch the clearing without feeling completely blind. My flashlight stayed on the passenger seat, pointed toward the door, like a weak little guard dog I didn't trust. The cold kept creeping in no matter how high I turned the heater. It felt less like temperature and more like pressure, as if the air itself had weight. My hands ached, knuckles stiff, and I realized I'd been gripping the steering wheel again without meaning to. I forced myself to breathe slowly. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Same thing I'd done in the desert during sandstorms. Same thing I'd done after my divorce, sitting alone in this same van, convincing myself solitude was a choice, not a consequence. The knocking came back. This time it was unmistakable. Wood on wood. Slow. Deliberate. 3 knocks again. Always 3, coming from the direction of the restroom building. I leaned forward, peering through the windshield, heart slamming so hard it blurred my vision. The beam from a single flickering light, how long had that been there, cast a sickly yellow glow across the concrete pads. And then I saw movement. A shape passed through the light and vanished behind the building, human-sized, upright. My mouth went dry. Relief and dread collided in my chest. A person meant answers. It also meant intentions. I cracked the window just an inch. "Hey," I called, my voice sounding thin, unfamiliar. "You all right out there?" The word all right echoed oddly, breaking apart as it bounced off the trees. No answer. Just the sound of footsteps now. Slow, shuffling, circling the clearing. Gravel crunching under weight. Too heavy to be a deer. Too uneven to be confident. I slammed the window shut and slid down in the seat, pulse roaring in my ears. My mind scrambled for logic, for a version of events that didn't end badly. Maybe another camper. Maybe someone lost, just like me. But that explanation didn't account for the smell growing stronger, nor the way the footsteps stopped every time I looked up, as if whatever was out there knew exactly when I was watching. Minutes stretched, or hours. Time lost its shape. A soft tap landed on the side of the van. Not a knock. A tap. Fingertips. I froze, every muscle locking as the sound came again, tracing slowly along the metal, nails dragging lightly, testing. I could hear breathing now, shallow and wet, right outside the driver's door. I squeezed my eyes shut, fighting the urge to shout, to do something, anything that would break the paralysis. A whisper slipped through the thin walls of the van. Elliot. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Hearing my name spoken in that place, in that voice, shattered something inside me. I didn't remember ever telling anyone my name on this trip. I hadn't checked in anywhere. I hadn't spoken to another person in days. Panic surged, hot and blinding. I reached for the keys and shoved them into the ignition, hands fumbling so badly I almost dropped them. The engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life, headlights flaring and flooding the clearing with harsh white light. There was no one there, no figure by the door, no footprints in the damp earth, just empty campsites and that crooked restroom building, its door swinging gently, creaking as if stirred by a breeze I couldn't feel. The smell retreated slightly, but it didn't disappear. I didn't think. I slammed the van into gear and hit the gas, tires spinning before catching on the gravel. The exit road loomed ahead, narrow and steep, framed by trees that seemed to lean closer than before. As I drove, the knocking returned, not from outside, but from inside the van, from the walls, from beneath the floor. I screamed then, a raw animal sound ripped out of me as I forced the van up the incline, engine screaming in protest. The headlights jittered over shapes that shouldn't have been there, faces in the bark, mouths open, eyes tracking my movement. I knew it wasn't real. I knew fear could do that, but knowing didn't make it stop. The road twisted sharply, tighter than I remembered, branches scraping along the sides of the van like grasping hands. The smell flooded back, choking, sweet and rotten. The knocking turned into pounding, synchronized with my heartbeat, with my breath, with the engine's desperate roar. Go, I begged aloud, just go. And then the road ended, not gradually, not with a warning. It simply stopped, dissolving into a wall of trees and rock. I slammed the brakes, van skidding sideways, heart lurching into my throat. The headlights illuminated nothing but forest. No turnaround, no shoulder, no sign that this had ever been a road at all. I sat there, shaking so hard my teeth clacked, staring at the impossible dead end. My mind refused to accept it. I knew I'd driven down this road. I knew it led back to the highway. But the forest in front of me was ancient, unbroken, its roots thick and tangled like veins. Behind me, the darkness moved. Shapes gathered at the edge of the headlight's reach, just beyond where light could define them. I could feel their attention, heavy and focused, pressing in from all sides. The whisper returned, no longer hiding. You missed your turn. The words slithered through the van, curling around my thoughts. I clutched the steering wheel, fighting the urge to give in, to shut the engine off and step outside, just to make it stop. Some distant, rational part of me understood then what this place fed on, not flesh, not blood, but hesitation. Doubt. The moment you questioned your own reality. I threw the van into reverse and floored it, not caring where I went, only that I moved. The world lurched as the van bounced over rocks and roots, branches shattering against the windshield. Something heavy slammed into the side panel, denting the metal with a scream of tearing steel. The headlights flickered. For one terrifying second, they went out completely, plunging me into a darkness so complete it felt solid. In that instant, hands pressed against the glass from the outside, leaving smears that glowed faintly, like phosphorescent fingerprints. Then the lights snapped back on. I burst out of the trees onto pavement so suddenly it felt like being spit out. The van fishtailed, tires squealing, before I brought it under control. Ahead of me stretched a normal road, cracked but real, guardrail rusted, yellow lines worn but visible. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I drove until my chest burned and my eyes ached from staring too hard at the asphalt, terrified it would vanish again if I blinked. When I finally dared to glance at the GPS, it was back on, blinking calmly, as if nothing had happened. No River's End campground, no unnamed road, just a blank stretch of forest labeled unincorporated land. I didn't camp that night. I drove until dawn bled pale over the hills and pulled into a crowded truck stop, parking between semis with their engines rumbling like sleeping animals. I sat there shaking, watching people come and go, clinging to the noise and light like a lifeline. But even there, even surrounded by strangers and concrete, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. Not physically, not anymore, but quietly, lodged somewhere deep inside, waiting for the next time I trusted a road just because it invited me forward. And I knew, with a certainty that still tightens my chest years later, that if I ever found myself near the Trinity Alps again, that place would be waiting. I stayed at that truck stop until the sun climbed high enough to burn the fog off the asphalt, until the world looked solid again, edges sharp, sounds predictable, reality stitched back together in a way my mind could accept. People walked past my van without looking at me, and I let that anonymity steady my breathing. No one knew what I just escaped. No one would believe it if I tried to explain. That, I would later understand, was part of the damage. When I finally pulled back onto the highway, my hands still trembled on the wheel. Every signpost felt like proof of survival. Every mile marker grounded me. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't want music or voices or anything that might blur the line between what was real and what wasn't. Silence this time felt earned. I drove straight home. No detours, no scenic routes, no curiosity. The van rattled with every bump, the fresh dent on the side panel catching the light when I passed reflective signs. I didn't look at it for long. I already knew what it meant. Evidence. Not of what I'd seen, but of what I'd almost accepted. For weeks afterward, I told myself it was exhaustion, stress, a trick of isolation layered over an unfamiliar road. That explanation fit neatly into the version of myself I preferred. Experienced, rational, unshaken by shadows. But denial has a shelf life, and mine expired the night I tried to plan my next trip. I sat at my kitchen table with maps spread out, paper ones this time, tracing routes I'd taken dozens of times before. When my finger hovered near Northern California, my chest tightened. Not fear exactly, something deeper, a warning that didn't shout. It waited. I did what anyone trying to regain control would do. I searched county records, Forest Service archives, old campground registries, anything that might mention River's End. Nothing. No permits, no closures, no history. I widened the search, scanning forums, half-abandoned travel blogs, comment threads, buried under years of dust. That's when I found them. Not stories, fragments. A paragraph here, a sentence there. Someone mentioning a campground that wasn't there last time. Someone else describing a road that led nowhere, but somehow back. Most of them ended the same way. Confusion, embarrassment, jokes about getting turned around in the woods, but a few didn't joke. A few never posted again. That's when the memory shifted. Not as something that haunted me, but as something that taught me. The fear lost its raw edge and hardened into understanding. The Trinity Alps weren't dangerous because they were wild. They were dangerous because they were old. Older than maps. Older than intentions. Some places don't want to be found, and when they are, they test whether you know the difference between invitation and permission. I went back to camping eventually. Slowly. Carefully. I stuck to places with ranger stations, check-ins, clear boundaries. I learned to trust the quiet voice that rises before logic, the one that doesn't explain itself but never lies. I stopped romanticizing isolation. Solitude is powerful, but only when you can leave it. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear knocking, not on the van, not on the walls. Inside my chest, 3 slow beats when I hesitate too long over a decision that feels wrong. Knock, knock, knock. A reminder. Not every road is meant to be followed. Not every destination exists to welcome you. People like to believe the wilderness is neutral, that it simply is. But I've learned better. The land remembers. It watches how you move through it, how quickly you doubt yourself, how easily you surrender your instincts for convenience or curiosity. That campground near the Trinity Alps wasn't evil. It didn't chase me. It didn't need to. It waited for me to do what so many of us do when the path looks promising and unfamiliar. We step forward without asking what the road is asking in return. I don't camp alone anymore, not because I'm afraid of being alone, but because I respect how easily the mind can be bent when there's no one there to anchor it. I leave itineraries, I mark my routes, I turn around when something feels off, even if I can't explain why. Especially then, because some roads in California don't lead somewhere unsafe. They lead somewhere unfinished. And if you stay long enough, they start to expect you to finish the story for them. The first thing I noticed was how quiet the lake had become, as if it was holding its breath for something I hadn't agreed to witness. My name is Caleb Rourke. I was 37 that summer, born and raised in Bakersfield, the kind of guy who believed he understood the rhythms of Central California, the dry heat, the restless wind, the way night always came faster than you expected in the mountains. I'd been camping most of my adult life, usually alone, usually in my old Volkswagen Westphalia, faded green paint blistered from decades of sun. That van had been with me through breakups, layoffs, long stretches where the road felt safer than people. I trusted it. I trusted myself. That trust is what nearly kept me there too long. I pulled into Lake Isabella campground just before dusk, July heat still clinging to my skin even as the sun dipped behind the ridgeline. The air smelled like dust and warm pine sap, a scent I'd always associated with relief. Civilization thinning out, noise dissolving. Families were packing up for the night, kids whining, coolers slamming shut. By the time I leveled the van and shut off the engine, most of the campground had gone quiet, the kind of quiet that feels earned. I remember thinking I'd timed it perfectly. By 9:30 p.m., the temperature dropped fast, the kind of cold that doesn't warn you, just slides under your clothes and settles in your bones. I cooked a simple dinner inside the van, the faint hiss of the stove loud in the stillness. Outside, the lake reflected almost nothing, no moon yet, just a black surface swallowing sound. Every once in a while, a fish broke the surface, a soft plop that echoed longer than it should have. I told myself that was normal. At 10:18 p.m., I checked the time because something changed. Not outside, inside me. A pressure, subtle but insistent, like being watched without proof. I'd felt it before, in the wild, that flicker of instinct we're trained to ignore because it doesn't come with evidence. I pushed it down the way I always did. That's when I saw her. She stood just beyond the ring of my lantern light, near the edge of my campsite. Not emerging, not approaching, just there. Close enough that I could see her outline clearly, far enough that her face stayed in shadow. She wore something light-colored, maybe a dress or a long shirt hanging loose around her frame. Her hair fell straight, dark, unmoving despite the breeze that tugged at everything else. She didn't speak. I waited for the sound of footsteps, a cough, anything human that would resolve the shape into a person with intentions. Nothing came. My first thought was that she might be lost. Lake Isabella gets tourists who underestimate the terrain, wander farther than they mean to. I slid open the van door, letting the hinges creak on purpose, a signal that I was awake, aware. "Hey," I called out, keeping my voice even. "You okay?" She didn't respond. The silence stretched, not empty, but heavy. It pressed against my ears, made the hairs on my arms lift. I took a step closer to the edge of the light. She didn't retreat, didn't advance, just stood there, arms at her sides, head tilted slightly, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. I remember thinking how close she was standing. Too close for comfort, too close for someone with no words. Campground's pretty empty, I tried again. Ranger station's back that way. Still nothing. That's when I noticed the smell. It wasn't the lake or the trees. It was something sour, metallic, faint but unmistakable, like damp pennies and old water. The smell drifted in waves, growing stronger the longer she stood there. I felt my stomach tighten, a deep animal warning cutting through my rational explanations. I told myself not to escalate. Don't assume danger. Don't create a problem where there isn't one. That's what experience had taught me. Panic makes more mistakes than predators ever do. But silence does something else. I asked her name. I asked if she needed help. Each question fell flat, swallowed by the night. No crickets chirped, no wind moved. Even the lake seemed to have gone still, its surface smooth and dark like a sheet of oil. She took one step closer, just one. The distance between us shrank enough that I could see her feet, bare, pale against the dirt, toes stained dark as if she'd been standing in water for hours. My chest tightened. I felt trapped in my own campsite, the van suddenly too small behind me, the open space in front suddenly hostile. "Please," I said, and hated how thin my voice sounded. "You're making me uncomfortable." Her head lifted slightly then, just enough that I caught a glimpse of her face. I wish I hadn't. Her eyes were open too wide, whites reflecting the lantern light, unblinking. Her mouth hung slightly open, lips dry, cracked. She looked less like someone waiting for help and more like someone waiting for permission. The smell intensified, filling my nose, making my eyes sting. I took a step back into the van and slid the door shut hard, the metal bang echoing across the campground. I locked it, hands shaking, heart pounding so loud I was sure she could hear it. Through the window, I watched her stand there, inches from the glass now, closer than anyone should ever stand without knocking. She raised her hand slowly, palm hovering near the window, not touching it. And still, she said nothing. Minutes passed, or seconds. Time lost its shape. My mind raced through options. Start the engine, drive off, call out to someone, turn off the light. Each choice felt wrong, like the environment itself was weighing my decisions, daring me to make the wrong one. Then, without warning, she lowered her hand and stepped back, retreating into the darkness as quietly as she'd appeared. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the driver's seat, keys in the ignition, eyes fixed on the tree line, listening to the silence I'd once welcomed. And in that silence, I realized something that would change the way I camp forever. Words can warn you, sounds can scare you, but silence watches. I stayed frozen in the driver's seat long after she vanished, my hands wrapped so tightly around the steering wheel that my fingers went numb. The lantern light inside the van felt too bright now, like it was advertising my presence to whatever still lingered beyond the trees. I reached over and twisted it down low, leaving just enough glow to see the dashboard and my own reflection in the windshield. Wide-eyed, pale, breathing too fast. The silence didn't leave with her. It thickened. Lake Isabella at night usually carries a low chorus. Wind brushing through brush, distant engines from the highway, the subtle life of insects reminding you the world hasn't stopped. That night, none of it existed. It felt as though sound itself had been removed, peeled away layer by layer, until all that remained was my heartbeat and the faint creak of the van settling as it cooled. I kept expecting to hear footsteps retreating, twigs snapping, proof that she was moving away from me. Nothing came. I told myself she'd been real. A person. A woman who needed help and didn't know how to ask for it. I told myself the smell had been the lake, the darkness playing tricks on my senses. That explanation was easier to hold on to than the alternative, that something about her presence had bent the night around her, warped my perception. At some point, my eyes started to burn from staring. I leaned back just for a second, and that's when I heard it. A soft sound. Not outside. On the van. It wasn't a knock. Knocking implies intent, a beginning and an end. This was slower, a gentle pressure like fingertips dragging along metal. Nails maybe. Testing. Learning the shape of the door. The sound traveled from the rear panel forward, stopping right beside my seat. I stopped breathing. The smell came back immediately, stronger now, seeping through the seams of the van, filling my lungs. I felt trapped inside my own body, every instinct screaming to run, while my mind argued for stillness. If I didn't move, maybe whatever was outside wouldn't escalate. That logic had worked before, with animals, with people. But this wasn't behaving like either. The dragging sound paused, then resumed, this time higher, tracing the outline of the window beside me. I stared straight ahead, afraid that if I turned my head, I'd see her face inches from the glass again. My reflection stared back instead, eyes darting, jaw clenched so hard it ached. "Go away," I whispered, though I don't know who I was talking to anymore. The sound stopped. The silence rushed back in, louder than before. My ears rang. My heart pounded against my ribs like it was trying to escape first. I waited, counting breaths, counting seconds, trying to anchor myself in time. Then the van shifted. Just slightly. A subtle sway, like someone leaning their weight against it. Not enough to rock it hard. Just enough to let me know I wasn't alone. The Westphalia had always felt sturdy, a small fortress on wheels. In that moment, it felt thin, fragile. A skin stretched over fear. I snapped. I reached forward and turned the key. The engine coughed once, loud in the dead air, then roared to life. The headlights flooded the campsite, washing over dirt, trees, empty picnic tables. I expected to see her illuminated there, standing too close, staring back at me. There was no one, but the relief didn't come, because the moment the lights came on, something else became visible. Footprints, bare footprints, pressed deep into the dirt around the van, circling it. Too many for a single approach. They overlapped, crossed as if she'd walked around and around while I sat frozen inside. The toes dug in sharply, the heels deep, each print angled toward the van, never away. I slammed the gear into drive. The van lurched forward, gravel crunching under the tires. As I pulled out of the campsite, my headlights swept across the edge of the lake, and for just a fraction of a second, I saw movement near the waterline. A figure standing ankle-deep in the lake, facing away from me. Not walking. Not reacting. Waiting. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I drove until the campground road blurred, until the highway lights burned my eyes and the familiar hum of civilization crept back in. I didn't pull over until I reached a gas station miles away, the fluorescent lights harsh and unforgiving. I sat there shaking, engine still running, trying to piece together what had happened without letting my thoughts spiral. I considered calling the ranger station, reporting a woman wandering the campground late at night. But how would I explain the silence? The smell? The footprints that made no sense? So I didn't. I slept in the parking lot instead, surrounded by noise and light, waking every hour with the image of her eyes burned into my mind. Morning brought clarity, or at least the illusion of it. I drove back toward Lake Isabella in daylight, telling myself I needed proof. Closure. Something to confirm that fear hadn't rewritten the night into something it wasn't. The campground looked ordinary in the sun. Families returned. Kids laughed. Boats cut across the lake, shattering its surface. My campsite was empty. The footprints were gone. But the dirt around the waterline told a different story. The ground was churned up, wet earth disturbed as if someone had stood there for a long time. I asked a nearby camper if they'd seen anyone matching her description. They shook their head, uneasy. "There was a drowning here a few years back," the man said after a pause. "Woman went missing, never found her body." The air felt colder then, even under the sun. I thanked him and left, the lesson settling deep in my chest, heavier than fear. Some warnings don't come as screams or threats. Some arrive as quiet presence, as space invaded without explanation. And if you ignore them, if you mistake silence for safety, you might find yourself standing too close to something that never needed words to begin with. I didn't leave Lake Isabella right away after that conversation. I should have. Every rational part of me said to get back in the van, point it south, and put as much distance as possible between myself and that water. But fear doesn't always push you to flee. Sometimes it roots you in place, makes you believe that understanding is safer than ignorance. I told myself I just needed to ground the night in daylight, that if I stayed a little longer, the memories would lose their teeth. That was the lie I used to remain. By mid-afternoon, the heat returned in full force, the July sun pressing down until the lake shimmered like a sheet of glass. The campground filled again, engines idling, radios playing low, the world behaving the way it was supposed to. I walked along the shoreline where I'd seen her standing, my boots sinking slightly into damp sand. The smell was gone, replaced by algae and sunscreen. normal smells, comforting ones. But the ground felt wrong. Every step carried a faint resistance, like the earth hadn't settled properly. I crouched near the water's edge and pressed my palm into the mud. It was cold beneath the surface, unnaturally so, the chill seeping into my skin faster than it should have. I pulled my hand back, wiping it on my jeans, unsettled by how long the cold lingered. I spent the rest of the day pretending to relax, reading, making coffee, watching people pass. I even nodded back at a couple who waved as they walked their dog. But every time the wind died, that same heavy quiet crept in, the memory of it tightening my chest. As evening approached, I felt the familiar internal argument begin. Leave now while you can. Don't be dramatic. You're tired. That's all. I'd built my life on trusting my ability to rationalize fear away. It had kept me functional, independent. It had also taught me how to ignore instincts until they learned to whisper instead of shout. I stayed. By the time darkness settled again, the campground thinned out faster than the night before. Clouds rolled in, swallowing the stars, leaving the lake a featureless void. I ate in silence, every small sound magnified. I caught myself listening for footsteps again, for breathing that wasn't mine. At 10:18 p.m., without intending to, I checked the time. My stomach dropped. The air shifted at once, temperature sliding downward like a hand down my spine. The smell returned faintly, carried on a breeze that hadn't existed seconds before. I didn't wait this time. I stood up, keys already in hand, heart racing. That's when I felt it, a presence behind me. Close. Too close. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. The space around my body felt compressed, like the air itself had learned the shape of someone else and was pressing me into it. My breath came shallow, my chest tight with the certainty that if I moved the wrong way, something irreversible would happen. She was there. I could feel her in the way the night leaned in the way the sounds vanished again. I smelled the lake on her, stagnant water and metal, loss and time layered together. I realized then that she hadn't followed me from the night before. She had never left. I forced myself to speak, my voice barely holding together. I can't help you. The words felt important, necessary. Silence answered. I turned slowly, every muscle screaming. She stood exactly where she had the night before, just inside the edge of my light. The same dress, darker now with moisture. The same bare feet, coated in mud. Her eyes met mine, and this time I saw something else there. Not anger, not hunger, expectation. I understood then that my fear wasn't what had drawn her closer. It was my hesitation. I'd stayed. I'd returned. I'd stood near the water again, letting my curiosity override the boundary my instincts had tried to draw. That was the invitation. She raised her hand once more, palm out, hovering between us. The space between her fingers dripped steadily, water hitting the dirt with soft, rhythmic taps. Each one sounded louder than it should have, echoing in the silence like a countdown. I stepped back, then another step, never breaking eye contact. The van loomed behind me, my only refuge. I fumbled for the handle, fingers slick with sweat. She took a step forward. The ground beneath her feet darkened as water pooled, spreading outward, seeping toward me. The cold reached my boots, biting through leather. Panic surged then, pure and unfiltered, burning away thought. I yanked the door open and threw myself inside, slamming it shut as the van rocked violently. The sound returned all at once, metal groaning, water splashing, my own ragged breathing. I locked the door and started the engine in one motion, the headlights cutting through the dark. She stood in front of the van, close enough that the light didn't soften her features. Her skin looked wrong, stretched tight, as if it no longer belonged to her. Her mouth opened wider than it should have, but no sound came out. Just water, pouring down, soaking into the ground at her feet. I didn't swerve. I didn't honk. I reversed, tires spinning, then turned hard and drove, heart hammering, tears blurring my vision. In the mirror, I saw her recede into darkness, still standing, still waiting. I didn't stop driving until dawn. I don't camp near water anymore. I don't ignore the moments when the world goes quiet around me. Because I learned something at Lake Isabella that night. something I carry with me every time I park the van and turn off the engine. Silence isn't empty, it's a boundary. And when something stands too close without crossing it, when it watches instead of speaks, when the night itself feels like it's leaning in, that's not the absence of danger. That's the warning. The first thing that felt wrong wasn't the heat, it was the silence. The kind of silence that presses inward, like the desert itself is holding its breath and waiting for you to make a mistake. My name is Elliot Warren. I was 36 years old when this happened, born and raised in Bakersfield, California, close enough to the desert that I thought I understood it, but far enough away that I still respected it. I'd been RV camping for over a decade, long enough to trust my instincts, but arrogant enough to believe I could explain them away when they didn't make sense. That trip to Death Valley was supposed to be simple. A solo reset. A late summer drive in my old Volkswagen camper van, the kind with faded paint and a pop top that groans when you lift it, like an old man getting out of bed. I chose Death Valley because people fear it for the wrong reasons. They think it's just heat, just emptiness, just miles of nothing. I'd camped in deserts before, Mojave, Anza-Borrego, even stretches of Nevada that felt like the end of the world. I told myself this was no different. I told myself the desert only kills the unprepared. That was the first lie I told myself out there. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped just enough to be tolerable. The sky was clear in that brutal way only deserts manage, stars sharp as broken glass, the Milky Way smeared overhead like a pale scar. I parked in a dispersed camping area off a dirt access road, far enough from the main route that headlights wouldn't sweep past me all night. No cell service, no nearby campers, just me, the van, and the wide, indifferent dark. I cooked a simple meal on my camp stove, ate slowly, listening to the wind slide across the valley floor. It wasn't loud, just a low, steady movement, like something large shifting its weight in the distance. I remember thinking how ancient the place felt. Older than roads, older than maps, older than the idea that humans belonged anywhere at all. By midnight, I was inside the van, windows cracked, lying on my back and staring at the ceiling. Sleep didn't come easily. It never does in unfamiliar places, but this was different. My body felt alert in a way I couldn't explain, like it had already noticed something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. I kept telling myself it was nothing. Desert paranoia. Too much silence makes you invent problems. At 3:03 a.m., I sat straight up in bed. I didn't know why at first. No noise, no movement. Just a sudden bone-deep certainty that I was no longer alone. The air felt heavier, thicker, like the van had been sealed, and slowly depressurized. I held my breath without realizing it, listening. My ears strained, searching for something. Footsteps, wind, an animal, but there was nothing. The silence had changed. It wasn't neutral anymore. It felt deliberate. That's when I noticed the light. At first I thought it was my own reflection. A trick of the glass. I leaned forward, heart starting to thump harder than it should have, and parted the curtain covering the rear window just an inch. 2 red lights hovered in the distance. They weren't bright like brake lights or LEDs. They glowed dully like embers buried under ash, perfectly still, perfectly level, too high off the ground to be a vehicle, too far apart to be a headlamp. I told myself they were radio towers, aircraft beacons, anything that fit inside the neat box of explanation. But I'd driven this road before sunset. There were no towers, no structures, nothing but salt flats and low ridges stretching into darkness. The lights pulsed once, slow, subtle, like a heartbeat. My mouth went dry. I checked my watch. 3:03 a.m. Exactly. That detail lodged itself in my brain for reasons I still can't explain. The time felt intentional. I watched the lights for what felt like a long time, though later I realized it couldn't have been more than a minute. They didn't move closer. They didn't drift away. They just stayed there, watching. And I became uncomfortably aware of how exposed I was, sitting in a thin metal box in one of the most isolated places in North America. I pulled the curtain shut, my hands trembling despite my efforts to keep them steady. I told myself to lie back down, to sleep. to laugh about it in the morning. That was when the smell started. It seeped in slowly, subtle at first, sharp, metallic, like overheated brakes or burnt copper. It didn't belong out there. Desert air has a dryness to it, a clean emptiness. This smell felt manufactured. Wrong. I sniffed again, hoping I was imagining it. I wasn't. My chest tightened as my mind began scrambling for explanations. Electrical short in the van. Something overheating. I swung my legs down and checked the dashboard, half expecting smoke. Everything looked normal. No warning lights. No heat. The smell grew stronger. Then came the sound. A low hum, barely audible, vibrating more than resonating. It wasn't coming from the van. It felt like it was coming from the ground itself, traveling up through the tires, through the metal frame, into my bones. My teeth felt itchy. My skin prickled. I froze. Every instinct I had told me to start the engine, to leave, to not wait for things to make sense. But another part of me, stubborn, rational, proud, insisted I was overreacting. That this was just fear feeding on isolation. That if I ran now, I'd be running from nothing. The hum deepened. Outside, something shifted. I heard gravel crunch. Not wind, not settling earth. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling. I held my breath again, pressing my palm against my chest to quiet my heartbeat. Each step was measured, heavy, as if whoever or whatever was out there knew exactly how loud it was being, knew I could hear it. The footsteps stopped directly behind the van. The red lights flared brighter, bleeding through the edges of the curtains like a warning. I whispered no without realizing I'd spoken aloud. A knock landed on the rear door. Not loud, not aggressive, just 3 slow taps. Knock, knock, knock. The sound crawled straight up my spine. I didn't move. I didn't answer. I didn't breathe. Another knock came, closer to the window this time, as if something was leaning in, adjusting its position. That's when the denial finally cracked. This wasn't an animal. This wasn't another camper. This wasn't something I could explain away with logic and bravado. Whatever was out there knew where I was, knew I was awake, knew I was listening, and it wasn't in a hurry. The hum reached a pitch that made my vision blur at the edges. The smell was overpowering now, burning my nostrils. My hands shook so badly I had to grip the edge of the bed to keep from giving myself away. The footsteps began again, this time moving toward the front of the van, toward the driver's door. I slid into the seat, keys already in my hand, sweat dripping down my back despite the cold that had crept into my bones. The moment my fingers touched the ignition, the humming stopped. The silence that followed was worse. No footsteps, no wind, no insects, just me, the van, and the certainty that if I didn't leave right now, I wasn't going to leave at all. I turned the key. The engine hesitated. Once. Twice. Outside, something exhaled. Long, slow, and close enough that the window fogged from the inside. The engine finally roared to life, and that's the moment the red lights began to move. The red lights didn't rush me. That was the worst part. They slid sideways across the darkness, smooth and unhurried, staying just beyond the reach of my headlights as I threw the van into gear and slammed the accelerator. Gravel sprayed beneath the tires, the Volkswagen lurching forward like it had been woken from a bad dream and didn't yet know how to run. The headlights cut a narrow tunnel through the desert night, illuminating dust, scrub, and nothing else, but I could feel the lights out there, pacing me, drifting parallel to the road. Every time the van bounced over a rut, my eyes flicked to the mirrors. Nothing. Then, there. A flash of red, gone before I could lock onto it. The hum came back, not as loud as before, but sharper now, threaded with a vibration that rattled the dashboard and made the steering wheel buzz under my palms. The smell followed me inside the cab, thick and hot, like scorched metal dragged across stone. I gagged and rolled down the window, and the cold desert air rushed in, but it didn't clear the smell. It mixed with it, made it worse. I told myself to focus on the road. Just drive. Just get back to pavement. But the road didn't behave the way it should have. The dirt tracks stretched ahead of me, pale and snaking through the dark, but something about it felt wrong, too long, too repetitive. The same crooked Joshua tree passed on my right twice. Then again. I recognized the bend ahead before I reached it, even though I knew I hadn't looped back. My chest tightened. "No," I said out loud, my voice thin in the cab. "That's not possible." The desert doesn't care what's possible. The hum deepened again, syncing with the engine's RPMs, like whatever was out there had tuned itself to me. The red lights flared brighter, closer now, one on either side of the road, floating at windshield height. They weren't reflections. They cast no beam. They just were, glowing with a dull, ancient patience. I felt watched in a way that had nothing to do with eyes. A sudden pressure built behind my temples, a squeezing sensation that made my thoughts feel thick and slow. For a terrifying second, I couldn't remember where I was going. The road blurred. The stars overhead twisted, stretching into faint spirals. That's when something knocked again. This time, it wasn't on the door. It came from beneath the van. A heavy, solid impact, metal groaning in protest. The steering wheel jerked violently to the left, nearly wrenching from my grip. I shouted and corrected, heart slamming against my ribs as the van fishtailed and barely stayed upright. The hum surged. I smelled ozone now, sharp and electric, like a storm building in a place that hadn't seen rain in years. "Get out!" I muttered. "Get out! Get out! Get out!" The headlights flickered. Once. Twice. Then the engine cut. The van rolled to a stop in the middle of the road, dust settling around me like a held breath finally released. Silence crashed down, absolute and suffocating. I sat there, frozen, hands still clenched on the wheel, waiting for the engine to turn over again. It didn't. The dashboard went dark. The smell lingered, thick enough to taste. Outside, the red lights hovered closer than ever, no longer distant, no longer pretending to be part of the landscape. They drifted forward, slow and deliberate, stopping just beyond the reach of the dead headlights. I realized then that there were more than two. They formed a loose arc around the van, at varying heights, pulsing softly out of sync with one another. Some were low, near the ground, others floated higher, as if suspended by invisible threads. My denial finally shattered. This wasn't something I could outrun. This wasn't something I could understand. This was something I had interrupted. The hum returned, now layered with something else, a faint whispering, not quite sound, not quite thought. It pressed against my mind, bringing flashes of sensation instead of words, heat without fire, pressure without weight, time stretched thin and brittle. I squeezed my eyes shut and fought the urge to scream. Images flickered behind my eyelids. Old roads swallowed by sand, headlights burning red instead of white, vehicles half buried and abandoned, doors hanging open like mouths frozen mid-cry. I smelled rust. I tasted dust. I felt a certainty settle into my bones that Death Valley didn't just erase people, it kept them. The driver's side door handle twitched. I snapped my eyes open. The handle moved again, slowly, testing the latch. My hands shook as I reached for the emergency brake, yanking it down harder than necessary. I didn't know why. Panic demanded action, any action. I fumbled for my phone, no signal, no bars, the screen glitching and dimming as if the battery were draining in real time. The whispering grew stronger. Not voices, intent. A pressure built in my chest, a sickening sense of invitation, like the desert was offering me a place to lie down and rest. Just open the door. Just step outside. The heat would take care of the rest. I slammed my fist against the dashboard, the pain grounding me. "No," I said, louder this time. "I'm not staying." The red lights pulsed in unison. The door handle jerked hard, metal screeching as something on the other side tested its strength. The van rocked slightly, suspension groaning. I lunged for the ignition and twisted the key again. Nothing. Again. The hum spiked, so loud now I felt it vibrating my teeth. The red lights surged forward, pressing closer to the windows, and for the first time, I saw something move between them, a distortion in the air, like heat shimmer given shape. Tall, unsteady, as if it didn't quite fit the rules of gravity. My lungs burned. I realized I'd been holding my breath again. The engine coughed. Once. The distortion froze. I twisted the key again, screaming this time, voice cracking as the engine roared back to life. The dashboard lights flared, brighter than they'd ever been, and the headlights snapped on, revealing nothing. The road ahead was empty. The red lights vanished as if they'd never existed. The hum cut out so abruptly it left my ears ringing. I didn't wait. I floored it. The van shot forward, tires screaming, as I tore down the road, every muscle locked tight, every sense stretched to breaking. I didn't look in the mirrors. I didn't slow down when the road smoothed into pavement. I didn't stop until the first hint of dawn smeared pale gray across the horizon. When I finally pulled over at a rest turnout miles away, my hands were numb on the wheel. The desert looked ordinary again, vast, empty, indifferent. No red lights, no hum, no smell, just silence. But it wasn't the same silence as before. This one felt like a warning that had already been given. I sat there until the sun rose fully, my reflection staring back at me in the windshield, eyes bloodshot and hollow. I knew, with a clarity that made my stomach turn, that whatever I'd encountered hadn't chased me away out of anger. It had let me go. And that was somehow worse. I don't camp alone anymore. I don't camp off-road in Death Valley. And when the desert goes quiet, too quiet, I listen to the part of myself I used to ignore. Because some mysteries in California are older than science, and they don't forgive curiosity twice. I thought leaving Death Valley would end it. That was my last mistake. The sun climbed fast, burning away the night like it had never existed. And by the time I crossed back into a stretch of civilization, cracked highways, faded signs, the skeletons of old service stations, I felt foolish for how badly my hands were still shaking. Daylight has a way of lying to you. It smooths sharp edges. It convinces you that whatever hunted you in the dark was just a trick of exhaustion and fear. I told myself that story for 3 hours straight. I told it to myself as I drove west, as the temperature climbed again, as the radio crackled back to life and spit out a half-forgotten classic rock station. I told myself that the red lights were aircraft, that the hum was my own engine struggling, that the looping road was fatigue and panic, tangling my sense of direction. I told myself I'd overreacted. The desert let me keep that lie, at first. I stopped once just outside Furnace Creek, long enough to fill a water jug and splash my face in a bathroom sink. My reflection looked wrong. Not injured, not sick, just thinned out, like some essential layer of me had been sanded down and carried off by the wind. The man staring back at me didn't look like someone who'd escaped something. He looked like someone who'd been marked. The drive home blurred. Every time heat shimmered above the asphalt, my pulse jumped. Every time the road curved just a little too smoothly, my mind whispered loop. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see that dull red glow hovering just out of reach. I didn't. Not yet. That night, back in my driveway in Bakersfield, I slept in the van. I told myself it was stubbornness, pride, a refusal to let fear chase me out of something I loved. But deep down, I think I was afraid to sleep inside my house, afraid of walls and ceilings and the way silence behaved indoors. At 3:03 a.m., I woke up again. No desert this time, no stars, just my quiet neighborhood streetlights humming softly outside the windshield. And that smell, burnt copper, hot stone. My heart began to race before my mind caught up. I sat up slowly, listening. The van was still. The neighborhood was still, but beneath it all, there it was again. That low, almost subsonic vibration, threading through the metal frame, humming through my bones like a memory that didn't belong to me. I checked my watch, 3:03 a.m. My stomach dropped. I forced myself to look out the rear window. The street was empty. Then the red lights bloomed into existence at the far end of the block. Not headlights, not reflections. Waiting. I don't remember unlocking the door. I don't remember stepping out. I only remember standing barefoot on the cool concrete of my driveway, the hum growing stronger with every step, my chest tight with a mix of terror and something worse, recognition. The lights didn't move toward me. They didn't need to. A pressure settled over the neighborhood, heavy and intimate, like the air before a storm that never breaks. I felt the same invitation I'd felt in the valley, that sickening sense of being offered rest, of being told gently that resistance was unnecessary. Images flooded my mind again, this time clearer. Old travelers, wagons, early cars stranded in the heat, People who'd seen the red lights and mistaken them for help, for civilization, for rescue. I understood then what they were: not predators, not ghosts, markers, beacons for things that don't need bodies the way we understand them, things that live in extremes: heat, pressure, isolation, and watch for moments when humans wander too far from the rules that keep them anchored. Death Valley wasn't haunted. It was inhabited, and I'd carried its attention home with me. The hum peaked, so strong it made my vision shimmer. The red lights pulsed once, bright enough to cast long, warped shadows across the pavement. I did the only thing I hadn't tried yet. I closed my eyes. I grounded myself in my body. The ache in my feet, the cool night air on my skin, the sound of my own breathing. I thought about limits, about borders, about the unspoken agreement humans make with the land when we pass through it instead of trying to conquer it. "I'm leaving," I said, voice shaking but steady. "I won't come back." The hum wavered. The lights dimmed. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the pressure lifted, like a hand slowly releasing its grip. The smell thinned. The vibration faded into the background noise of the world. When I opened my eyes, the street was empty again. No red lights. No hum. Just my quiet neighborhood, unaware of how close it had come to becoming something else. It's been years since that night. I still camp, but never the way I used to. I choose crowded sites. I leave at the first sign of things feeling off. And when the desert grows too quiet, I don't wait for proof anymore, because some mysteries in California don't want to be solved. They want to be respected. And once they notice you, they never really forget. End. If you'd like, I can now rewrite this for even slower psychological pacing, darken the ending further, less closure, adapt it for TikTok shorts hooks, or tailor it precisely to your channel's existing voice. Just tell me how you want to refine it.